In the quiet suburban sprawl of Maple Grove, Ohio, every lawn was manicured to perfection, every mailbox gleamed, and every resident knew one another's business. It was the kind of place where the sound of a leaf blower could spark a complaint, and one woman in particular made sure of it. Her name was Karen Whitmore. 58, short blonde hair always in a neat bob, crisp polos, and a clipboard practically glued to her hand. To most of Maple Grove, she was that HOA lady, the enforcer, the rule keeper, the woman who once fined a neighbor $50 for leaving their trash cans out an extra day. Karen took pride in her job, or at least, that's what she told herself. Order brings peace, she'd say, as she patrolled the cul-de-sac in her beige golf cart with HOA patrol stenciled on the side. But behind her tidy smile and stiff posture was a woman who didn't quite know what else to do with her life. Her husband, Greg, had passed 5 years ago. Her kids had moved away. The HOA was her last sense of control. That Thursday morning, as Karen made her usual rounds, she spotted something that froze her heart mid-beat. A beat-up blue minivan parked by the edge of the community park, rust on the doors, blankets pressed against the windows, a small pink bicycle leaning against the bumper. Karen narrowed her eyes. Not again, she muttered, gripping her clipboard. She parked, marched over, and tapped on the window. Inside, a woman in her 30s stirred awake. A tired mother, dark circles under her eyes. A little girl, maybe 6, was curled beside her. Ma'am, Karen said sharply. You can't park here overnight. This is private property. HOA rules. The woman blinked, disoriented. I'm sorry, we'll move soon. We just needed a place to sleep. Her voice cracked. Please. Karen hesitated. The girl sat up, clutching a stuffed rabbit, staring at her with wide, frightened eyes. Something twisted in Karen's chest, a strange flicker of guilt. Still, she straightened her back. You'll need to leave by noon, she said firmly. I'll give you a few hours. Back in her golf cart, Karen tried to focus on her next inspection, but her mind replayed that little girl's face again and again. That night, as she sat alone at her dinner table, eating reheated pasta in silence, her eyes drifted toward the park through her window. The van was still there, under a flickering streetlight. For the first time in years, Karen didn't feel righteous. She felt wrong. Karen woke up the next morning with a restless ache in her chest. The smell of her usual black coffee couldn't drown it. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the HOA handbook, a thick, spiral-bound thing that she practically lived by. Rule 14.3b. Unauthorized vehicles may not remain on community property for more than 12 hours. She read it twice. Then she looked out her window. The blue minivan was still there. Damn it, she whispered, grabbing her keys. When she reached the park, the mother was outside, brushing her daughter's hair with trembling hands. The little girl was humming quietly, her bunny tucked under one arm. Karen stepped out of her cart. You're still here, she said, though her voice lacked its usual bite. I'm sorry, the woman replied softly. The van wouldn't start this morning. I think the battery's dead. Karen sighed. This isn't a shelter, you know. The woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I know. We had nowhere else to go. My name's Elena, and this is Maya. I lost my job at the diner last month, and the landlord kicked us out. I've been trying to get help, but it's all waiting lists and dead ends. Karen stood frozen, her mind caught between the HOA manual in her hand and the exhaustion in Elena's face. Maya peeked up, her small voice barely above a whisper. We'll be quiet, promise. Karen felt her throat tighten. For once, she didn't know what to say. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the moment. It was Roger Phelps, one of the other HOA board members, a gruff man with mirrored sunglasses and an ego to match. Well, he said, stepping out of his truck. Looks like we've got trespassers. I'll call the tow company. Wait, Karen said quickly. Give them until tonight. They're leaving. Roger frowned. Since when do you go soft, Karen? Rules are rules. Karen felt heat rise to her face. The old Karen would have agreed, but something had shifted. She crossed her arms. I said tonight, Roger. He stared at her, then shook his head and drove off muttering. You've gone sentimental. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. She sat in her living room, surrounded by framed photos of community picnics and HOA awards that suddenly felt hollow. She looked out at the park again. The streetlight flickered over the same van, still unmoving. Finally, she grabbed her coat and walked out into the cold. Elena stirred when Karen knocked gently on the window. "What now?" she asked, her voice weary. Karen held out a small flashlight and a thermos. "Coffee," she said quietly. "It's still warm." Elena blinked, confused. "Why are you helping us?" Karen hesitated. "Because someone should." By Monday morning, the story of the blue van had spread like wildfire through Maple Grove. Neighbors whispered over fences. HOA members exchanged tight-lipped texts, and Roger Phelps had already called an emergency board meeting. Karen stood outside the community center, gripping her folder of reports. Her stomach knotted. She had spent all weekend helping Elena look for housing. She'd called shelters, churches, even the county office. Nothing. Everywhere was full. When Karen walked into the boardroom, the air was thick with judgment. 5 members sat in a semicircle, arms folded. Roger leaned forward with that smug grin she used to find reassuring. "Karen," he began, "as head of compliance, you've allowed an unauthorized vehicle to remain on HOA property for nearly 72 hours. Do you understand what kind of precedent that sets?" Karen's jaw tightened. "I understand compassion isn't a rule violation." Roger's smirk vanished. "You think this is a charity? We have residents complaining. Property values." "Property values," she cut in, her voice sharp. "That woman's living in her car with a 6-year-old. You're worried about property values." The room fell silent. For a moment, even Roger looked uncertain. Karen took a breath, her voice trembling but strong. "We talk about community all the time. Picnics, fundraisers, block parties. But what kind of community turns its back on a child sleeping in a van?" Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another cleared his throat. Roger slammed his notebook shut. "Enough. I'm calling a tow truck today." Karen stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. "If you do that, you'll have to call the cops on me too." There it was, the old Karen. But this time her rules were written by conscience, not a handbook. That afternoon, she drove straight to the park again. Elena was sitting by the van, clutching her phone in frustration. "No one's calling me back," she said softly. "We'll move, I promise." Karen shook her head. "You're not going anywhere." She looked around at the rows of pristine houses. "You're coming with me." Elena blinked. "What?" "I've got a spare room. It's small, but it's warm. You can stay until we find something better." Elena's lips parted, tears pooling in her eyes. "You don't even know us." Karen smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time I started knowing people instead of judging them." As they packed what little they owned into the van, Roger's truck appeared at the park entrance, tow chain rattling. He froze when he saw Karen standing there, arms crossed beside Elena. "Don't bother," she called out. "They're leaving as my guests." Roger glared but said nothing. He just drove off, muttering curses under his breath. That night, in Karen's quiet house, the smell of hot soup filled the air. Maya sat at the table drawing with crayons Karen found in an old drawer. For the first time in years, Karen felt something she hadn't felt since Greg's passing. Company, warmth, purpose. Winter melted into spring, and Maple Grove began to bloom again, not just in gardens, but in spirit. Word spread quickly about what Karen Whitmore had done. Some neighbors whispered in disbelief. Others started dropping off casseroles, clothes, and gift cards for Elena and little Maya. What began as gossip slowly turned into something else: admiration. At first, Elena tried to refuse most of the help. "You've already done too much," she told Karen one morning as they sat on the porch, mugs of steaming coffee in their hands. Karen shook her head. "It's not about what I've done. It's about what everyone should have done sooner." She looked out at the street where kids were riding their bikes. "I spent years making sure lawns were perfect, fences were level. And all that time, I forgot to look at people." Elena smiled softly. "Maybe you just needed a reason." That afternoon, a black SUV rolled up to Karen's driveway. Out stepped a man in a county jacket, a social worker, holding a clipboard and smiling wide. "Are you Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked. Karen nodded cautiously. "I heard from the community center that you've been helping a family in need. I just wanted to say thank you." And he turned toward Elena. "Good news. There's a transitional housing unit opening up next week. It's yours if you want it." Elena's hands flew to her mouth. Maya squealed, wrapping her arms around Karen's waist. Karen blinked back tears, hiding behind a shaky laugh. "That's wonderful," she said. "Truly wonderful." The next week flew by in a blur of cardboard boxes, hugs, and goodbyes. The day Elena and Maya moved into their new apartment, Karen helped carry in the last box herself, a small one labeled kitchen stuff. Inside, she noticed a folded piece of paper taped to the top. After the van drove away, Karen opened it. It was Maya's drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands under a big yellow sun. At the bottom, in shaky crayon letters, it said, "Me, Mommy, and Miss Karen, our family." Karen sat on her porch for a long while, that picture in her lap, the evening breeze brushing through her hair. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful, but this time, it wasn't the peace that came from control, it was the peace that came from connection. Weeks later, during the next HOA meeting, Karen surprised everyone by proposing a new initiative, Maple Grove Neighbors First, a program to help struggling families, veterans, and anyone in the community who'd fallen on hard times. Roger Phelps raised an eyebrow. "And who's funding this?" Karen smiled. "We are. Every one of us. It's time this neighborhood stood for something more than clean sidewalks." Applause filled the room. That night, as Karen drove home under the streetlights, she passed the same park where it had all begun, the place she'd once seen as a blot on perfection. Now, it felt sacred, because that was the day she learned that rules can keep lawns tidy, but kindness keeps hearts alive.